Yeah. Hey.
Not long after Mexico defaulted on its international loans in 1982, sparking a global economic crisis that ushered in what became called the lost decade in much of the developing world, agents from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, visited nearly every country in Latin America, and they brought with them a message, loud and clear. TINA is now, they said. There is no alternative. The way out of this economic catastrophe, they argued, is to embrace, or at least to re-embrace, as it were, economic liberalism, or neoliberalism. Now, strapped for cash and facing a crisis of hyperinflation, governments across the region threw up their hands and said, "Come on, man, that's political suicide. No way." Indeed, neoliberalism was extremely unpopular in Latin America. And not only was it associated with earlier eras during which the economies of Latin America were subjugated to the whims of those of the global north, but neoliberal policies themselves, that is, the retreat of the state, large-scale privatization of industry, the opening of capital and trade to global markets, all this would cause millions of people to suffer sudden unemployment and deepening poverty, and with little or no state-provided safety net to catch them when they fell. But to this, the IMF replied, "Yes, way," holding up loan agreements to which were attached substantial conditionality clauses that we call structural adjustment plans, SAPs. These asked all these captive governments, "Don't you want this money? Money, money, and money?"
It's not about the money, money, money. We don't need your money, money, money.
So, one by one, all these governments signed their nation's fates on the dotted line. Those who refused to soon saw their governments collapse in the face of massive protest, and their successors quickly learned the lesson. TINA, there is no alternative to what the IMF wants us to do, which is also what the United States wants us to do, which is why neoliberalism also came to be called the Washington Consensus. But how did Latin America get to this point, where in a matter of just a few years, the entire region was compelled to give up on a long-held dream of economic independence? Well, because just about everything we study in this class has deep historical roots, let's jump back in time a bit. Back to, say, 1821, 1821. Recall that around this time, wars of independence were raging throughout Latin America. In 1821, it was Mexico's turn. And on September 16th of that year, a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla declared his country's independence. He lost his head, but his call to arms successfully led to Spain's abandonment of the territory he called home, which stretched at that point from present-day Guatemala all the way up to Northern California. That's a freaking lot of land. But the wars of independence killed the Mexican economy, which was built chiefly upon gold and silver mining and agriculture. Moreover, the countryside of Mexico was ruled by feuding warlords who invariably worked at odds with the new government's mission of national unity. So, in the span of 40 years, the presidency in Mexico flipped about 50 times, and this dire political instability drew the attention of the powerful and rapidly growing neighbor to the north, the United States of America. Which reminds me, do you know what chickens do when they see a fellow bird in a state of sickness or distress? Well, they pounce on it ruthlessly. I mean, if you don't intervene, they'll actually kill the poor little guy. In any case, Americans began settling in the Mexican province of Texas by the thousands as early as 1822, and very soon they outpopulated the Mexicans there by about 10 to 1. So it was that in 1835, these Americans declared themselves independent. And a decade later, eyeing a really big prize, the American president at the time, James K. Polk, saw over the annexation of Texas, knowing well that this was going to lead to war with Mexico. This was a fine opportunity, he thought, because fighting a brand new country in deep political turmoil was really easy pickings. And victory in such a case would give Polk basically anything and everything he ever dreamed of, which was basically a United States that stretched from sea to shining sea. Yes, and so it was that 2 years later, in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed between the victor and the vanquished, giving the United States everything that we today called Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. A lot of freaking land went to the United States. By the way, the original bear flag of the Republic of California was made from looted women's undergarments. That's a weird story, but reportedly true. Now, why talk about the US-Mexican War and territorial conquest? Well, this is what set the precedent for an unequal but codependent political-economic relationship between the Colossus of the North, the United States, and not just Mexico, but virtually the whole of Latin America. From this point on, economic policy south of the US border would be understood primarily in terms of what the United States wanted or did not want. That is, Latin American governments would either articulate policy in line with American interest, embracing their dependence in exchange for some access to American consumer markets, or they would try very hard to break free of this dependent relationship and thereby stoke the ire of the US government. Now, in the wake of the Mexican-American War, or as they call it in Mexico, the War of North American Invasion, the broken, humiliated political elite in Mexico had few alternatives. TINA, as it were. They had no alternative. They needed to embrace liberalism, that is, open up their economy to foreign investment, privatize and commodify land holdings, and above all, dismantle any and all institutions that, in whichever way, impeded the advancement of capitalism, especially the Catholic Church, which owned nearly half of all Mexican territory, but also collective ownership rights of land that were associated with indigenous peoples. In this way, liberalism won the day in most of Latin America, roughly marking the period between 1855 to 1929. And it changed a lot of things in the region. First of all, it pinned the economic well-being of Latin America to a new set of great powers, the United Kingdom and the United States specifically, which were at the time the two leading industrial powers. This was good in that money started to pour in Latin America since the colonial period.
It's not about the money, money, money. We don't need your money, money, money.
And when markets were doing well up in the north, this was great. Industrialization needed cheap raw materials and foodstuffs that Latin America is well situated to provide. But it was also bad because, as they say, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Time and time again, recessions in the United States would provoke major economic and political crises throughout Latin America. But liberalism also changed the social and political structures of the region. Socially, capitalist development under the liberal model generated growth, but at the cost of high levels of inequality. And this is by design, because Latin America's comparative advantage, that sort of term that was coined by the free market advocate David Ricardo back in 1817, its comparative advantage was in cheap labor. And to maintain that advantage, Latin American governments had to keep their populations poor and dependent. Now, this worked all right for a few decades, but it eventually would lead to serious problems. For liberal theory is not just about economics, but politics as well. And politically, liberalism calls for democracy and political equality. And that is simply not possible when the foundation of your economy is a cheap and exploitable labor force. So what then? Well, again, Mexico's experience is instructive here. By 1910, the contradictions between the country's liberal economy and its highly exclusive illiberal political system was too much for the disgruntled aristocrats of the country as well as the starving peasants alike to stand for. And in rebellion against the 35-year rule of the dictator Porfirio Diaz, Mexico dissolved into a violent and brutish civil war that year, the Mexican Revolution as it came to be called. It would kill upwards of 1.5 million people, or about 10% of the entire population, and then lead to major political and economic transformations, the impact of which would extend throughout all of Latin America in the coming decades. In essence, the Mexican Revolution ushered in a new idea, which was that
it's not about the money, money, money. We don't need your money, money, money.
Liberalism was little more than a blueprint and justification for the exploitation of poor countries by rich countries, and that, importantly, it could be dispensed with, violently if need be. Of course, the death knell of liberalism didn't ring until much later, on October 24th, 1929 to be exact, Black Thursday. The United States didn't just sneeze that day, but it puked and it shat simultaneously in a violent and febrile convulsion. And naturally, Latin America didn't just catch a cold, but instead braced itself for more than a decade of economic contraction and fervent political upheaval. It was this mayhem of the Great Depression era that saw a new, identifiably Latin American political economic ideology take root from Mexico all the way down to Brazil and Argentina. It came to be known as ISI, Import Substitution Industrialization. And its goal was to break the ties of dependence on the great powers up north, and then recreate a Latin America as a region economically autonomous and politically sovereign. How was it to work? Well, to begin with, it was never going to work in small countries with little ability to build up large domestic consumer bases. So forget about Central America here, and also forget about much of the Andean region, so Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia. For the big countries, however, like Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, each with populations of many tens of millions by the mid-20th century, there was some hope of success in ISI. In a nutshell, the plan was this. ISI would promote industrialization domestically by first imposing steep tariffs and quotas on imported industrial goods, making those goods expensive enough for people to buy so that they would choose instead to purchase goods produced domestically. Then the state would subsidize and sometimes nationalize domestic industry in order to give it a jump start, if you will, and ensure that capital earnings from those industries stayed in country. Theoretically, these industries would mature over time and become competitive with international firms producing the same manufacturers. They just needed protection in the beginning. That's all. It was, in short, a way to artificially recreate the conditions in which the countries of North America and Europe had built their industrial economies nearly a century earlier. Note, for instance, that Abraham Lincoln's economic plan in 1860 proposed high tariffs on imported manufactures from England, specifically in order to protect America's industries against that competition. Anyways, this was ISI's idea. It was that once competitive, such protections and subsidies would be unnecessary. And so at some point in the future, Latin America's economies could then open up to the world and they would thrive. Now, the problem is that they never really matured into competitive industries under ISI. Many were the problems. Even in the largest countries like Brazil and Mexico, too great a portion of the population was too poor to consume the goods manufactured there. And so industry could not really benefit from a true economy of scale. Secondly, the industrial inputs and expertise for running and maintaining factories were simply lacking, and so they had to be imported at exorbitant cost from abroad. Third, capital was lacking too, and so this needed to be either borrowed from abroad, which entailed high interest rates, or it needed to be brought in via foreign investment, which usually came at the cost of real earnings on industry being pulled out of the country, which is exactly what they didn't want. And finally, there was always the problem of cronyism and corruption. More often than not, the heads of state-owned enterprises were appointed for political reasons instead of merit. And consequently, they failed to run those enterprises in efficient ways, often using them to funnel public monies into private pockets. Now, as a result of all these things, ISI failed to produce innovative, high-quality, and low-cost manufacturers in most of Latin America, such that if and when the region's economies ever were to open up to the global market, they would almost certainly fold in the face of international competition. In fact, many folded before this, as their products were just so bad. I learned this the icky way the first time I went to Mexico, back in the 1990s. At that time, there were almost no toilet seats in the country. If you needed to defecate, whether you were at your friend's home or in a government office building, you'd have to sit directly on the toilet bowl, which is usually gross and full of pee. Why? Well, the old state-subsidized toilet seat manufacturer made such crappy and expensive toilet seats, they broke all the time, they're really expensive to buy, that people simply stopped buying them altogether. So that over time, Mexico became a toilet seatless society. I'm happy to report that things have changed since the 1990s, and now you can find toilet seats almost anywhere in Mexico. In any case, as the inefficiencies of ISI accumulated, in the 1970s a new problem emerged. It was oil and debt. In 1973, OPEC formed. That's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, mostly Middle Eastern countries at the time, leading to a sharp increase in the price of oil around the world. Now, because of this, industrial production in Latin America suddenly became much more expensive on one hand. But also because of this, international loans became much more accessible to governments in Latin America, thanks to the oil profits elsewhere. Now, consequently, Latin American governments took out more and more loans to pay for increasingly expensive but still uncompetitive industrial output. And by 1982, it was just too much. That year, Mexico defaulted on its debt, sparking a huge global recession. And as I mentioned before, strapped for cash and facing rampant inflation, governments across Latin America were put in a bind. And that's when the IMF came in and said, "Tina is now, brothers. There is no alternative." And so it was that Latin America's experiment in autonomous economic development, its half-century effort to break its dependency on the economies of North America and Europe, had abruptly come to an end. Liberalism, or neoliberalism, or the Washington Consensus, was back in business. And the economies of Latin America were once again and irrevocably going to be dependent on those of the global north for a long, long time to come. Now, a whole lot has happened with Latin America and political and economic development since 1982, including a good deal of dabbling around with statist or even quasi-socialist policies associated with the so-called pink tide, which was roughly between 1999 and around 2013. However, neoliberalism continues to be the guiding economic principle across the region, with all its glitter and its glee, as well as all of its discontents. Now I want to ask you, what impact has this had on Latin America, its politics, and its society as a whole? And where is it leading us? Will it lead us to a bright future, that one that is predicted by advocates of the free market? Or will it lead us to another Mexican Revolution? Finally, is there really no alternative? I'm Professor Michael Wolf, and this is Latin American Politics Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel, soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre yo soy, la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo. La luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que ansió mojar.